So thank you all again very much for your patience, and welcome everyone to the 29th Goodman Lecture presented by Khyentse Foundation. My name is Trent Walker. I'm a member of the Khyentse Foundation Academic Development Committee. I'm also an assistant professor at the University of Michigan. For today's talk, we are very fortunate to have Dr. Catherine Dalton, who is an acclaimed translator and oral interpreter of Tibetan Buddhist texts and teachings, currently affiliated with 84,000, translating the teachings of the Buddha and Rangjung Yeshe Institute. Her lecture today is titled Study and Translation as Buddhist Practice. The Goodman Lectures, as many of you here know, are an online series designed to build bridges between academic and general audiences who might be interested in Buddhist studies. And this lecture, as well as all 28 past lectures in the series, are available freely online from Khyentse Foundation's website and social media channels. The Goodman Lectures are inspired by a longtime Khyentse Foundation friend and advisor, also a friend to our speaker today, Professor Stephen D. Goodman, who sadly passed away in 2020. Our series aims to reflect Stephen's enduring vision of making academic talks sponsored by the Foundation available to all. Again, many of you who are joining us have been to many Khyentse Foundation events. Just in case some of you are joining us here for the first time, and I see in looking at the participant list, there may be some of you. Just wanted to let you know, Khyentse Foundation, established by Dzongtsar Khyentse Rinpoche, has been supporting Buddhist study and practice since 2001, including through grants, scholarships, and other collaborations. And for more information, feel free to visit www.khyentsefoundation.org. As usual, we'll have this period of Q&A after the talk, so your questions are most valued at that time. So as I mentioned before, to ask a question to our speaker, please submit it via the chat feature to KF Q&A. In other words, not directly to me and not directly to Dr. Dalton, but through the KF Q&A feature in the chat box on Zoom, and then I'll be able to pose selected of your questions directly to our speaker. So let me proceed to a brief introduction of our distinguished speaker, Dr. Catherine Dalton. She is one of the most acclaimed oral translators and interpreters of Tibetan Buddhist teachings, and she's also extremely accomplished in the field of translating written texts from Tibetan and other Buddhist languages into English. She, as far as I understand it, began her journey in the study of Buddhism and Buddhist studies while still an undergrad at Middlebury College. She had a chance to study abroad during that time and encountered Dr. Hubert de Cleer. She also took a transformative class with one of her professors at Middlebury, William Waldron, on Madhyamaka Buddhist thought. And after that time, Catherine spent 10 years, I believe, in Kathmandu in Nepal, studying and very intensely at Rangjung Yeshe Institute, where she earned an MA with a thesis under Dr. Andreas Doctor. And after that, in 2001, under the guidance and suggestion and encouragement of her teacher, Choki Nyingma Rinpoche, she came to Berkeley to pursue a PhD in Buddhist studies under the guidance of Professor Jacob Dalton. That's where I had the great fortune to meet Catherine. We entered this PhD program at the same time, and I must say it was a real privilege to sit in seminars and classes with her. Really, the depth of her experience with Buddhist texts in Tibetan and Sanskrit, her long experience of studying Buddhism in Asia, and just sort of the infectious energy and enthusiasm she brought to the study of Buddhist texts in the academic classroom was a real marvel to be around. Dr. Dalton's dissertation was on a transformative 8th century Indian Tantric Buddhist exegete and practitioner named Buddha Jnanapada. The specifics of her dissertation focused on one of his works known as the Tutiya Krama Tattva Bhavana Mukhagama, which is a really quite extraordinary work that combines autobiographical elements of the journey to realization by Buddha Jnanapada with a very sophisticated explanation of his doctrinal developments as well as his ritual developments, which are reflected in his other compositions as well. And that her dissertation really effectively situates Buddha Jnanapada within this 8th century 8th century Indian tantric Buddhist world. And of course, the innovations by Buddha Jnanapada and his contemporaries went on to have a great influence in the world of Tibetan Buddhism. In the field of Buddhist translation, Dr. Dalton has been, I believe, a founding member of the Dharma Chakra Translation Committee under the guidance of Chokyi Nyimo Rinpoche to translate numerous Buddhist texts into English, some for the 84,000 Project, others for other outlets. And these translations include both philosophical and ritual texts, as well as sutra material coming out of the canon. One that I have been sort of particularly moved by is this long and important translation of the Lalita Vistra, which is very, or I think translated in her translation as the play in full, which is a really quite extraordinary presentation of the life narrative of the Buddha. Today, Catherine has two different roles. She's an associate research professor at Rangjung Yeshe Institute, where she has previously taught, particularly in their MA programs. And she's also an associate translator with 84,000, translating the words of the Buddha, as well as, of course, continuing her fabulous oral interpretation service for Chokyi Nyimo Rinpoche and other important teachers in Tibetan Buddhist traditions. So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Dalton. The floor is yours. Thank you so much for being with us today, Catherine.
Thank you, Trent, for that very kind introduction. It's a pleasure to be here with wherever we are with all of you today. We're, I guess, all over the globe, but nonetheless, a pleasure to connect in this environment. And I wanted also to say thank you to the Khyentse Foundation for inviting me to give a Goodman lecture. When Trent asked me to give a lecture in this series, I felt like I couldn't say no, in part because, Stephen Goodman was a dear friend of mine, and I felt like participating in this lecture series would be a kind of a way to honor Stephen, to honor his Dharma practice, his erudition, his delightful and unconventional character. The talk that I'm going to give this evening, for me it's evening, I'm in Kathmandu. I apologize for any Kathmandu city sounds that you might hear in the background, maybe some motorcycles, horns, airplanes. I'm in Bodhanath, and maybe there are some of you out there who love and miss Kathmandu, and you can enjoy it vicariously through the sounds, the background noises. And anyway, as I was saying, the talk that I'm going to give this evening is not going to be a traditional academic talk, but my path has also not been a traditional academic path. I've been involved in Buddhist studies and translation in both a traditional Buddhist practice-based environment for many years in Nepal, and also in the West, actually, but interestingly, first in Nepal and only later than in the West. But I also have academic degrees in Buddhist studies, as Trent noted. 3 of them, my BA and MA and PhD, are actually all in Buddhism, Buddhist studies from modern academic institutions. And interestingly, both my BA and PhD advisors, Bill Waldron and Jake Dalton, are in Kathmandu right now, and I just met both of them last night. So Bodhanath is kind of a magical meeting place. Anyway, what I would like to talk about this evening a little bit is approaching the study of Buddhism and the translation of Buddhist texts in the context of the path of Buddhist practice. And I chose this topic for a few different reasons. One is that my teacher, Chokyi Nyimo Rinpoche, frequently encourages his students to become or to be scholar practitioners. And I wanted to take this opportunity to reflect a little bit about what that might mean, what that does mean or can mean in our modern context of study and translation, especially for those of us who are involved in environments where we engage in study and translation in both a traditional Buddhist practice-based environment and then also the study of Buddhism and the translation of Buddhist texts in a more academic kind of environment. And I also felt like this topic is pretty appropriate for the Goodman Lecture series because Stephen actually was really very much a scholar practitioner. My personal relationship with him was really as a Dharma friend. Of course, we were both involved in Buddhist scholarship and translation, and of course, we talked about those kind of things sometimes, but I mostly spent time with Stephen in environments where we were receiving Dharma teachings together, and occasionally at a Buddhist studies talk at Berkeley here and there. But the very last time that I saw him before he passed was at my PhD dissertation defense. I didn't know he was coming, and he lived nearby. He must have found out that it was happening, and he just showed up. And of course, he was a Buddhist scholar, and there were other Buddhist scholars there, so it was a reasonable place to be. But for me, the feeling that I got when I saw him there was the feeling of a Dharma friend showing up for you somewhere. And so it was really touching for me, actually. So for me, he was really an exemplary embodiment of the scholar practitioner. And so I felt like this topic is also perhaps appropriate in that way as well. So again, what I'd like to reflect on a little bit is the process of the study of Buddhism and the translation of its texts as a form of Buddhist practice, what that might mean, and what some of the advantages of this kind of approach can bring to us both personally, those of us who are engaging in that way, and also to our scholarship and our translations, the work that we're producing, and therefore also to the readers and the recipients of that kind of scholarship and that kind of translation that's been done in that manner. And I want to be clear, I'm not saying this is the only way to approach Buddhist studies and translation. Of course, I'm not saying that I think that people who aren't Buddhist practitioners shouldn't study Buddhism or translate Buddhist texts. I definitely have, and I'm sure all of us have benefited quite a lot from the scholarship and translation work that has been done by scholars who don't have that kind of personal practice connection with the Dharma. But I do want to explore the particular benefits, what particular benefits a more integrated approach might bring for those who do connect with Buddhism in both of these ways. And also, by the way, I hope that these reflections are not going to be relevant only for Buddhist scholars and translators, because I presume that many of you who are listening maybe are not a scholar or a translator in that sense, but maybe you're a Dharma student and a Buddhist practitioner. So in that case, I would encourage you to listen to what I'll share this evening with a sense of openness towards perhaps bringing the study of Buddhism more into your personal practice and thinking about the ways in which study really can be or really is a form of practice for a Buddhist practitioner. And, just the ways that studying, including when those studies happen in a modern academic environment, the ways that that kind of study can really deepen and enhance personal practice, because I think it really can. So the modern academic approach to studying traditions like Buddhism has often been one in which the study or translation is treated as a discipline totally separate from the practice of Buddhism as a path leading to awakening. And as I'm sure that many of you are aware, there were many decades when a scholar of Buddhist studies was somehow almost not even allowed to acknowledge a personal relationship with Buddhism, lest they be considered unable to carry out a properly objective scholarship on their topics of research. So people who were Buddhist and scholars weren't really open often about their personal relationship with Buddhism. And it's a little bit funny because in other disciplines like the study of Christianity, for example, even and including in a modern academic environment, very many of the scholars who were pursuing those disciplines were themselves Christians. I studied Christianity in a religion undergraduate program with a professor who was a Christian, not a missionary, but a minister. And that was normal. That is normal and has been normal for a long time in those kind of academic environments, but somehow not the case with scholars studying Buddhism and traditions like this. And I'm speaking specifically here about the West. It may be different in places like Japan, where there is both a robust tradition of academic study of Buddhism and centuries of Buddhist practice, right? But in the West, actually, these norms are really changing. And they have changed quite a lot over the past few decades, so that within the Buddhist scholarly community, now it's pretty much okay, to be openly a Buddhist practitioner. But what I'm interested in thinking about is ways in which it might not just be okay, but actually especially good to be a scholar who is also a Buddhist practitioner, or a translator who is a Buddhist practitioner. And I want to think about those benefits kind of bi-directionally. So I want to consider the benefits that having a personal practice-based relationship with Buddhism might have for someone's Buddhist studies scholarship and for their translation, and also what benefits doing Buddhist studies scholarship and translation might bring for a Buddhist practitioner, because I do think that the benefits go both ways. So let's first talk about study and then about translation, because anyway, we have to start there. You can't be a translator without also being a scholar, because you can't translate something that you haven't learned and don't really understand. So what might a Buddhist approach to the study of Buddhism look like? And how might that kind of approach be particularly beneficial? Well, first of all, Buddhism, I think, is very well suited towards that approach of study and inquiry, because inquiry and investigation is really encouraged and emphasized within the tradition. At least my own teachers have always very strongly encouraged it. In a passage that has been often cited by my teachers, the Buddha himself encouraged his disciples to investigate his teachings like a goldsmith examines gold, right? Really checking, really examining and investigating and learning. And so the Buddhist teachings themselves, and of course they are very extensive and cover many topics, but the teachings basically invite us to learn, to investigate reality, and to investigate our perception of that reality. And so learning and inquiry and investigation are an essential part of the Buddhist path. The very first teaching that the Buddha is said to have given on the Four Truths tells us to acknowledge suffering. But you can't acknowledge that unless you learn more about your experience and really stop and check and find out what really is the case with respect to your own experience. So study or investigation has always been an integral part of the Buddhist framework for practice. And within the traditional Buddhist context, though, study, or just the pursuit of knowledge, let's say, is never an end in itself. The traditional triad is, right, study, reflection, and meditation. And in Tibetan, by the way, the term I'm translating here as study, right, in study, reflection, meditation, is te, which literally means to listen. So the terminology around study here is connected with the living tradition. And studying from or hearing teachings from a person who has learned them and is ideally embodying them and then passing them on. So in that sense, the sense actually that we get from that and from the tradition is that you can't fully learn just from books, and that there is something that is transmitted in the explanation of the teachings that makes them accessible in a way that just reading about them doesn't. In any case, the traditional paradigm of study, reflection, and meditation, basically, if you ask a Buddhist, what is the purpose of study in Buddhism? The purpose of study is to gain an understanding, which is to be contemplated and integrated into our direct experience through meditation. So in a Buddhist context, the teachings are not meant to be learned intellectually, just learned intellectually. They actually don't function like that, because just knowing them doesn't really help, in the sense that an intellectual understanding isn't transformative on a personal level. And we don't really change unless we really take something to heart and integrate it into our experience. And the tradition gives us a number of metaphors that are meant to convey the detriments of studying without actually integrating it into our experience. So to hear the Dharma but not assimilate it into our being is to be like a river stone, right? It's been immersed in water perhaps for thousands of years, but when you break it open, it's dry on the inside. So being surrounded by all that water didn't really do anything for the stone in the sense of moistening it, right? And the purpose of learning the teachings, I think that metaphor is meant to teach us, to show us, is that the purpose is to integrate them so that they actually help us, so that the teachings do something for us. That's why they are out there. That's why they have been given in the first place. And if we don't relate to them in that way, again, following another traditional metaphor, if we learn the Buddhist teachings and fail to apply them to our experience, we might end up in a situation where we are dying of thirst right next to the edge of a great river or a lake. So it's all right there for you, but you're not actually using it for what it's meant to do, and you're suffering. So all of this really just, what I'm trying to say with this, and what I think the tradition is trying to teach us with those kind of examples and metaphors that we hear, is that in the Buddhist context for study is the context of pursuing transformation, personal transformation, becoming gradually freed from our painful, afflictive emotions, gaining, or maybe you can say uncovering, more and more aspects of wisdom and other good qualities, and eventually, if we think about it in terms of the Tibetan term for the word Buddha, Sangye, completely purifying all of our obscurations, Sang, right, purifying them, and then fully unfolding or perfecting Gye, the wisdom, so that we awaken to Buddhahood ourselves in order to serve others and help others, right, in the Mahayana context. So study is a really important first step on that path. In another triad that frames how study or intellectual understandings fit into the context of Buddhist practice, Chukyinuma Rinpoche often reminds his students that we need to first understand and then experience and then realize. So again, in this framework, the whole process of learning and intellectually understanding something is just the very first step in approaching the Buddhist teachings. And so it's the first thing that we're meant to do with them, but very far from the last. And so if we're studying in a Buddhist context, study then, what study looks like, what study actually is a gateway to contemplation and integration leading towards personal transformation. Sometimes the word dharma in Tibetan, chu, it's explained to mean chu, which means change or improvement or transformation. So dharma is for transformation. That's what the Buddhist teachings themselves tell us. So how then might approaching the study of Buddhism in this way, this traditional way, as a part or as an aspect of Buddhist practice, how might that help us with our studies in the sense of really learning the topics that we are studying, and also in the sense of studies that are related to scholarship that we might be producing on Buddhist topics? Well, if the topics that we're learning are explicitly articulated within a framework that goes beyond just learning them on an intellectual level, can we really say that we learn them at all? Can we really learn them at all without acknowledging and maybe even exploring that broader context that involves integrating them in some way into our experience in a more practice-based way? I think that's a reasonable question to ask and to consider. There's a number of academic institutions that are actually opening more to this kind of approach. There are contemplative studies departments, concentrations, initiatives in universities, modern universities, that are taking the position that contemplative traditions cannot really be studied effectively without some exploration of the contemplation that those traditions teach, or at the very least, that approaching learning about those traditions alongside the application and integration of some of their contemplative practices will enrich that learning. So approaching Buddhism in the framework of Buddhist practice can really bring the benefit, I think, of a better and more multidimensional understanding of what we're learning. And when it comes to producing scholarship on Buddhist topics, this deeper engagement, this broader engagement, I think improves a scholar's ability, can improve a scholar's ability to really understand a topic that they're studying, and therefore also their ability to communicate about it with others in their own scholarly work. So I think we can really appreciate the scholarship done by Buddhist scholars in terms of the kind of depth that their practice-based relationship with the Dharma can bring to their scholarly work. And another benefit for scholarship done by scholars who are also practitioners is the kind of connection that that kind of scholar practitioner often has with the living tradition. Of course, it's not exclusively scholars who are Buddhist who work closely with teachers and practitioners within the tradition, but it is usually the case that those of us who are Buddhist practitioners do have close relationships with living teachers. And connecting and studying with Buddhist teachers, of course, enhances our understanding of Buddhism. I think that's just kind of obvious. But what is interesting to me is that even if our studies concern a topic that is more historical, for example, and not immediately or directly connected to modern study and practice traditions, the model of the modern tradition and just being familiar in a close way with Buddhist traditions, with Buddhist worlds, it can help us to understand the ways in which Buddhist traditions and societies work. And this can actually open up doors to perspectives on historical figures and situations that might otherwise not be available to us, might remain kind of opaque to us. I love Buddhist history myself, and the approach or perspective that I generally take in my own academic research is pretty historical. You could say maybe philological and historical. I'm not out there doing hardcore philosophy. I did study philosophy for 10 years, actually, in our monastery from our monks, and first of all, that's not much time when it comes to the study of Buddhist philosophy. And also, I haven't spent much of the past 10 years really doing so much with that. So I've really taken more of a historical approach in my personal scholarship. But I do really feel like the example of living traditions and my living teachers has opened doors to understanding historical figures and their relationships and motivations in ways that I wouldn't perhaps have understood had I not had that kind of connection. So just for example, we often learn about historical Buddhist teachers who had relationships with political figures, with governments, with kings and queens, and so on, right? And oftentimes, scholars kind of take the position or make the assumption that the primary motivation, the motivating factor for those kind of relationships on the part of the Buddhist teacher was some kind of personal gain or gain, to support their tradition or monastery or whatever it may have been. But based on seeing modern teachers who also have those kind of relationships and seeing them seek to bring benefit to the person that they are connecting with in those kind of relationships, not the other way around, has really affected the way that I understand or am open to understanding those kind of historical relationships too, honestly. So seeing things in a way that's actually almost exactly the opposite of the assumptions that are otherwise made sometimes by scholars who are studying Buddhist history. And I think that I wouldn't have really been able to hold those kind of perspectives with relation to historical figures had I not just seen living examples of that happening in the modern world. And so it really can actually studying or being around the modern tradition very closely can really impact the way that we understand Buddhist history too, which is, I think helpful for our scholarship. So I think that approaching the study of Buddhism within the framework of Buddhist practice actually means approaching the tradition with the benefit of a kind of openness, rather than closing doors by somehow preventing an objective study of the tradition as if there were an objective study possible of anything at all. It's just not possible to study things objectively. I think that this way of approaching the tradition in scholarship, it creates a framework that opens doors rather than closing them. It creates a kind of openness. So these are some ways in which approaching Buddhist scholarship within the framework of Buddhist practice might be beneficial for our understanding of the tradition and therefore for our scholarship. When we look to the personal benefit that can come in studying within this kind of framework, I think we find really good examples of this in many living teachers. Because the Buddhist tradition emphasizes this kind of practice-based approach to study, my teachers often emphasize that we should study, contemplate, and meditate yamatawa in an integrated way. So without somehow regarding these things as separate activities. And because the tradition emphasizes this approach, then we do see it embodied in a lot of traditional scholars. We can see it that way. And I feel personally very fortunate in that when it comes to integrating studies and practice, so many of my teachers have modeled this so beautifully that I always have a really good example to look to for how to do that. But basically, the personal benefit of studying as a form of practice, which requires taking our studies to heart, allowing what we learn to change us, the benefit is just that we change. We become kinder. We become better teachers to our students in an academic environment. I think better scholars and better people. And again, it's not just studying Buddhist philosophy or doctrine that can do this. Studying Buddhist history can be such an incredible inspiration for practice. Learning about the ways that people in the past engaged with the tradition and transformed through it, just like we in the present are also trying to do, it can be so helpful, personally, like very helpful for practice. So there's a verse encapsulating the Buddha's teachings that Chögyam Rinpoche likes to repeat often, and it's something like, do not engage in any evil actions, engage in a wealth of virtue, tame your own mind. This is the Buddha's teaching. So it's kind of hard for me to see how following those directives wouldn't just generally be a good idea for anyone, whether you're Buddhist or not. And of course, the third part about taming one's mind has a lot of different, there are a lot of different ways to approach that depending on the type of Buddhist practice that someone is engaging in. But if you're saying that evil deeds are things that harm oneself and harm others, and virtue is something that helps oneself and helps others, then of course, integrating that kind of perspective and intention into our lives, and then really pursuing that in action is going to be helpful. So for me, that's basically the way that I try and approach studying Buddhism within that kind of framework. And, like all of us, it's something that I'm working on, but it works. It does work. There are benefits. We can see benefits arising from that approach. So what about when it comes to translation? A lot of the same principles that I have already mentioned in the context of study apply to translation as well. Basically, if we are practicing the materials that we are translating, then very specifically, right? Sometimes it could be in a very specific way, or even if we are just generally training in Buddhist practice, we may be able to make better sense of what we're reading and what we're learning, and therefore to understand it better, and therefore better able to translate it, right? Because Buddhist texts were written explicitly for the purpose of being integrated into practice. And that includes many, many different genres of Buddhist texts. Of course, practice-based texts like sadhanas and sadhana commentaries, right? Like a liturgical or meditation practice texts, meditation manuals. Of course, those are meant for practice. But so are philosophical writings. The philosophical writings of Buddhist authors are written in order to be integrated into our experience through practice. And even histories, right, or life stories of Buddhist practitioners, they're also meant as didactic tools to teach us what the lives and practice experiences of great practitioners have been like, and to act as kind of an inspiration or a guidance for personal practice. So since I think basically we can say all Buddhist texts are generally written for the purpose of practice, then it makes sense that a translator would be potentially able to access them more directly if they're practicing them, or even just generally practicing the Buddhist teachings, integrating Buddhist teachings and principles into their own lives. And of course, in particular with certain kinds of texts, the connection with the living tradition is immensely, immensely valuable. Some texts a teacher's not even going to discuss with the translator unless the translator is practicing them. So there are so many ways in which that connection with the tradition is extremely beneficial for translation work. But I think that there are some other factors too, where relating to translation as Buddhist practice can change the outcome of the translation. And one really important point, I think, is motivation. Our motivation when we do anything, of course, affects the outcome of what we're doing. But with translation, if we are approaching translating a text with the intention of bringing about personal transformation through what we learn in that text, and bringing about some real benefit to a reader, or even just bringing benefit to all beings by making that wisdom, the wisdom contained in that text, more widely available in the world, right? If we have that kind of motivation, that kind of intention, the intention brings something into the translation that isn't there when that intention isn't there. And I think a translation that is prepared with a genuinely altruistic motivation impacts a reader more deeply. It impacts the reader differently. So a translator always works with this kind of perennial issue in translation, right? Balancing faithfulness to the original text with readability in the target language. And my personal experience, though, with translating within the framework of practice, of trying to maintain an altruistic motivation and also allowing the flavor of my practice to kind of enter the space of the translation process, I feel that that really does affect and improve the resulting translation. So keeping this kind of openness, the openness and the freshness of meditation practice in the space of translation breathes a particular quality into the words that come out. And I think it makes those words and their meaning more available to a reader. So when I think about the translation work, and here I'm thinking in particular, the translation of meditation manuals comes to mind, but the work that's been done by translators who I know personally, who are really good Dharma practitioners and serious meditators, to me, there's a particular flavor to the translations that they do that makes it easier to relate to the text and its content in a way that's more impactful for me personally. There's another thing about working as a translator and taking the practice of translation as a form of Dharma practice, which is, I've heard this so many times from my teachers, on this saying, on the ball of pride, the water of good qualities cannot remain. So in order to be really transformed by the Buddhist teachings, we have to overcome our pride. And when that's at least a goal, a personal goal, and something that we keep in mind, it allows us to translate better. Because again, we're tending towards openness rather than towards closed-mindedness. So we can learn more, we can constantly learn, we can learn from the texts that we read, we can learn from our teachers, we can learn from other translators. And of course, if we're constantly learning, we are going to be becoming better translators. So it's very easy and also very dangerous to learn something and feel like we know it, and then get caught up in our feeling of knowing, this kind of pride of knowing about something, pride in what we think we know, and then being unable to change our understanding because of that. My teachers always warn us students that becoming learned and then feeling proud about it utterly defeats the purpose of learning in the Buddhist context. Because what we're trying to do is overcome our afflicted emotions by studying the Dharma, not get more of them, right? And so I think it's really to our detriment as translators to get caught in that kind of trap too. And so having a Buddhist practice that encourages us to take care about that is really beneficial. It's quite important. And for me, just by the way, the most helpful thing in avoiding that is just to have really amazing teachers, because I just have to take one look at the qualities and accomplishments of my teachers, and yeah, that kind of problem starts to fade away when it does appear. And again, I think this is really obvious, but I just want to say very directly that all of these things that I'm talking about now are things that I myself am always working towards as a translator, as a scholar, and as a practitioner. I personally see a lot of benefit in cultivating these kind of things and attempting to do so. And so I'm just mentioning them as something that I think can be helpful for other people, and also to myself to remember for those of us who are really working to try and integrate study and practice, or translation and practice. I have the fortune of working not just as a textual translator, but also as an oral interpreter. And there, especially when the teacher is right there and there's a room full of Dharma brothers and sisters, Dharma students right there, for me, that's a situation where embracing the translation environment with practice is actually almost unavoidable. It's especially the case when translating for someone like Chukanima Rinpoche, who embodies the Dharma teachings so fully that just being in his presence just naturally draws us into this space of practice. But in any kind of oral interpreting context, in the same way that in a meditation practice session, I would start by adjusting my motivation, beginning with some prayers and supplications, settling into the practice, and at the end, closing with dedications and aspirations. I do that every time I translate for a teacher. And I'm quite sure that using that very same framework that we use for meditation practice, I think it makes me a better translator. It allows for kind of openness and ease. And I think that it helps clear away any kind of barriers that I might otherwise unintentionally be putting up, that could stand in the way of being able to clearly translate the words of the teacher. And when interpreting for my own teachers, my gurus, in the same way that the quality of devotion can open a student up to experience in meditation practice that is otherwise not available to them without that quality of devotion, I think the quality of devotion can open a translator up to capacities that are otherwise not available to them. I've had to try to teach oral interpreting to translation students a number of times. And it made me really reflect a little bit on what is actually happening when I translate for my teachers. And honestly, I don't really know what exactly is happening. I do know that sometimes things that wouldn't otherwise seem possible do happen, like actually remembering what Rinpoche said when he spoke for more than half an hour for 45 minutes at a stretch. And somehow I am actually able to remember what he said. Or I only slept a few hours and was feeling exhausted when the teaching started, but then I'm still able to do something that requires a tremendous amount of attentiveness. And maybe I even become more energized through the process. So those kind of things I feel are really strongly connected to capacities that are opened or unfolded through a personal connection of devotion to my teacher. And that's such a personal thing to say in a kind of public environment. But anyway, somehow I elected to talk about practice and translation in connection. So I really do feel that that's true in my experience. Buddhist translation in general has also historically been approached very much within the context of Buddhist practice. So when I was doing my doctoral studies, I did a little bit of research into the translators of some Guhya Samaja Tantra materials in the Tibetan canon. And what I did was I looked at the translators' colophons, these short statements that appear at the end of the text where the translators identify themselves and sometimes add some comments about the translation sources, process, and location, and so on. And so I was looking at those colophons, and I was also looking at Tibetan histories that discussed the history of the transmission of the Buddhist teachings from India to Tibet. And what I found was that very often the translators who appear in the colophons of the textual tradition also appear in the histories as transmitters of those traditions whose text they were translating, as lineage holders. And it means, of course, that those translators were upholding the practice systems of the text that they translated. They were engaged in that. And setting aside here the question of lineage holding in Buddhism, in, as it's transmitted into new cultures, that's a separate topic that I'm not going to get into. But the model here, what I want to say is that the model here of translators who are practicing the texts that they translate, it's very clearly visible in the historical record. And back here in the modern world, we also have a lot of examples of translators who are practitioners, both inside and outside of academia. And as I mentioned, for me personally, texts translated by those practitioners do bring a certain kind of impact that I feel strongly is connected to the translator's practice. And for me, working as a translator in Chukyinima Rinpoche's Sangha, I have always had as models good translators who are also good practitioners. And I've been really inspired personally by them to try and uphold that tradition of pursuing translation within the context of pursuing practice, Dharma practice. So the personal benefits of doing translation as a Buddhist practitioner are, for me, really significant. I'm incredibly grateful for the opportunity to be able to serve in this particular way. It actually wasn't something I ever set out to do. It just kind of happened because of a pretty childish idea back when I was quite young that I had to be able to communicate directly with Tibetan teachers and to read texts in Tibetan in order to really learn Tibetan Buddhism. I didn't trust translators basically as intermediaries. I don't feel that way now. But for me, it really has been a blessing to have had that kind of attitude at one point in my life because it made me learn Tibetan. And that led me to doing translation work, not because I wanted to be a translator actually, but because it was needed. And I'm quite grateful for a number of reasons. One is simply because as a translator, when we're translators, we have the opportunity to study a lot and to learn a lot. Being an oral interpreter means receiving a lot of teachings and listening really carefully to them because you don't have the opportunity to get distracted. And being a textual translator means spending a lot of time reading Buddhist literature. So for a Dharma practitioner, it means that, if we're able to do that within the attitude and framework of practice, basically it means that the job of translating is just a form of Dharma practice. And Chukyinima Rinpoche often reminds students at the Rangjung Yeshe Institute that study is practice when we approach it as practice. And I think the same definitely applies to translation. But with translation, one added benefit is that not only is it a form of study, but to translate, we have to internalize something and then externalize it again, but with a sense of clarity, right? So it really is a process of bringing the teachings deep inside. And for that reason, it can be a really profound gateway into practice experience. When interpreting for Chukyinima Rinpoche, I've noticed that sometimes I'm particularly impacted by something that I hear Rinpoche say, right when he says it, but other times I am more personally struck or impacted by a statement when I translate it, when I articulate it. The impact is stronger somehow. So I think sometimes articulating a statement about the Dharma is what makes it really strike home for us. And for me, this happens more often in oral interpreting, I think, just because for me, that's the kind of translation that comes most naturally to me, and more naturally than textual translation. But I think the same kind of experience can and surely does for people happen in the context of textual translation as well. Because we read something and we may have a particular effect or impact that we experience through reading it. But when we translate it, the act of rendering it, of actually putting it out there in our own language, right, can bring a very deep personal impact. And again, here I'm assuming the target language is our own language. For me, it is, but it's not for a number of translators I know. And so the point, though, is just that sometimes the act of even just expressing something, whether in a spoken form or written form, is what can make it really hit home in a way that doesn't happen when we're just bringing it in rather than putting it out. So, of course, there's also the opportunity of being able to serve the tradition and our teachers by making the Dharma more available to people. And that's another benefit, of course, personal benefit that comes to translators working in this context. From a Buddhist perspective, we're making merit, right, through the process of translation, which is a gift to be able to do that. But since I'm trying to think about all of this a little bit in the relation to our modern world, I wanted to add a little bit here about how AI and machine translation might fit into all of this, especially the part about translation as practice. This actually isn't something that I've been thinking that much about, that I generally think that much about, but it came to mind recently because of an email that my friend Kurt Khyentse sent a few days ago, actually. He has worked on Tibetan machine translation system in particular called Dharma Mitra. And Kurt said that he saw that I was giving this talk, actually, and that he saw the title of the talk, and then he had recently read a blog post by the wonderful scholar and translator Dan Martin about machine translation. Dan, actually, I've been a little bit in touch with him, actually, following this email exchange. But anyway, the blog post, basically, Dan's blog post, plus the announced topic of this talk, got Kurt to thinking about machine translation in the context of practice, and he sent some reflections. And I want to share a little bit, actually, with what Dan mentioned in that blog post and what Kurt has shared with us by email, and then reflect a little bit about that as well. Basically, as I understand Dan, he says in this blog that despite how surprisingly decent, good even, some of the recent machine translation tools are, he said he feels like you have to breathe with the text to begin with, not add the breath in later on. And so he suggested that machine translation might be used to perhaps check our translations after we have made them, to see if we've made any unintended errors or could improve something, but he would not recommend to use it as a start for producing a translation, because he felt that actually the process might even take longer if you do it that way. And because of it being more labor intensive somehow in order to really produce something that is a good quality translation and might anyway just result in a lower quality translation. So then Kurt, again, this is just my understanding, right, of what Kurt was writing to us, but he said he feels like from the Buddhist perspective, basically a large part of the importance of translation is making the Dharma available for people, right, from a Buddhist perspective. So the Dharma is medicine for the illness of the afflictive emotions, these poisons that we all experience. So he was really thinking about comparing Dharma translators to apothecaries, making medical potions, right? Rather than artists, he said, let's think about translators as someone who is preparing medicine, an apothecary, preparing the medicine, right? The Dharma text in translation from a recipe, which would be the original source text. And Kurt said that he has received some feedback from translators using this program, Dharma Mitra, saying that using it made them more productive. And so then he feels like, well, isn't that what we're trying to do as Buddhist translators, as Buddhists who are translating to make the Dharma more Dharma, more accessible to more people? And I don't actually know how those translators are using it, though. Are they following the first draft method that Dan suggested might be less than ideal, right? Or are they using the check your translation method that Dan Martin was saying could be more helpful? But in any case, Kurt said, if the big part of the role of translators as Buddhists is to make the Dharma accessible as much as possible for others, then machine translation can be a great tool for that, right? Because if it's making people more productive, essentially. So hopefully I've represented Dan's and Kurt's ideas accurately here. But all of that got me to thinking a little bit about this in the context of the thoughts that I've been sharing with you now about the process of translation in the context of practice. And I agree that one of the big Buddhist benefits, you can say, for Buddhist translators is making the Dharma available. That's an important part of that process for someone who is a Buddhist practitioner and translating. And the merit, right, of helping people connect with the Dharma, that act of generosity, actually, of helping people connect with the Dharma through translation. But for me, also part of the benefit, both for the translator and for the audience, again, in the context of Buddhist practice, is bringing something of the practice into the translation, right? Bringing some aspect of the space of practice into the space of translation production and the result that comes about from doing it that way. So in letting the process of translation take place within the space of practice, both in the context of the intention or motivation behind our translation, but also actually in just bringing the translation about within that framework, within that space. So here, kind of in the same way that Dan talks about the artistry of breathing with the text, right? And how it's important to do that from the beginning. I feel like breathing the breath of practice or the freshness of the contemplation, the fresh space of meditation into the act of producing a translation is a really important part of the process in the context of Buddhist practice, right? Both for the translator and for the person who's going to read the translation that comes out of that process. So I'm inclined actually also to appreciate Dan's suggestion that machine translation could be potentially very helpful as a way of checking an already produced translation rather than creating a first draft. And also, just by the way, I work sometimes often on the kind of text that I feel confident that machines are never going to be able to translate anyway, just due to the complexity of the textual transmission issues and coded language and like so many different aspects of the text. So I'm not worried about losing my job, but anyway, these are just some very recent reflections that I've been thinking about in the context of something that's really it's happening in the world these days. And so it's something that we will have to think about in a lot of different contexts in our world. And I've never used machine translation myself for Tibetan, but some of our monks actually from Rinpoche's monastery did run a short translation text, a short Tibetan text that I had just translated. I spent like an hour translating it, and then they ran it through some kind of machine translation program. I don't know what it was, even what program they used. and in, I don't know, 10 seconds or something, probably it produced what I had spent an hour working on. I don't know. I didn't watch them do it. I was sitting in the backseat of a car in Mexico City, and then they just handed me a phone and said, check this out. Like, what do you think? And actually, so the text was a very elegant letter about the forthcoming opening of the 1,000 Buddha temple that Chukini Rinpoche has constructed in Lumbini. The opening ceremony will be in November, Lava Duchen, of this year. And the machine translation of that letter, it did actually have one point that made me reconsider a line that I had translated and think, oh, maybe there's a better way of saying that actually. But it also had some very crazy gibberish that came from not knowing the intricacies of the names, the abbreviations of the names of the deities and practices of that particular practice system that were referenced. And so, okay, yes, it did help me a little bit in improving a particular, one line of this letter. But if I had looked at that first, it could have, in this case, I knew the systems well enough that it wouldn't have thrown me off. But if I didn't, it could have really thrown me off course, actually. So I think, I don't know, we have to take all of this with some care, and really bring some reflections, both just in terms of the practicalities of using it, but also here, as I'm saying, in the context of practice and translation. I think it's important to just be a little bit careful and reflective about how we might relate to these kind of tools that are appearing more and more in our world. Anyway, this is a little bit of an aside, but maybe an interesting one given all of the developments in AI and changes that are coming about in so many aspects of the world as a result. So coming back to where I started about what does it really mean to be a scholar or a translator who is a practitioner, right? A scholar, practitioner, translator, to really try to integrate study and translation with Buddhist practice. Well, if we're approaching the study of Buddhism as practice, or endeavoring, really trying to bring what we learn as students of Buddhism into our personal practice, I think it mostly just means approaching what we learn with a good motivation, an altruistic one, and an openness towards real personal transformation, and making sure that those different aspects of learning and contemplation and meditation don't remain separated, right? That they don't remain somehow isolated from one another. And the same goes with translation. If we're going to be translating, when we just let whatever enters our minds on the intellectual level percolate down and enter into our hearts, when we open ourselves up to change for the better and let translation happen within the space of that kind of transformative practice, it benefits us and it benefits those around us. And that includes those who connect with our translations, and whether they're written translations or oral translations. And it also includes those who connect with our scholarship. So I think I'll stop here. And I think we have a little bit of time for questions if anyone has some. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Catherine, for that exquisitely constructed talk, and for taking the time to share your many insights with us. And also, of course, bringing forth these conversations with your peers, and especially these gems of wisdom from your teachers. So thank you again for sharing all that with us. As you all know, now is the time we have set aside for questions. As I sort of mentioned at the beginning, if you have a question for Dr. Dalton, please send a chat message with your question to KF Q&A, and then they'll relay some selected questions to me that I'll pose back to our distinguished speaker. Again, since there are many of us here today and our time is short, we might not get to all of your questions, but please encourage you to submit those. And while we're waiting for questions to roll in, Catherine, if you don't mind, can I begin with some of my own?
Sure.
So one, I wanted to come back to this question of the difference between written translation and oral interpretation. I've been reflecting a lot in working with graduate students at the moment whom sometimes I notice when they present their project orally to me, it really sparkles. And then when it's on the page, it doesn't necessarily have all of those qualities. Something sort of comes alive in the oral dimension. Can you speak about how your experience as an oral translator and that way of being with words affects how you approach a written translation?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Um, for me, I actually started doing oral interpreting several years before I ever did any written translation. And so that's something, and as I mentioned earlier, for me, that's something that I just feel is a little bit more, just comes more naturally as something that, I don't know, just comes out of me in a particular way that is more natural. And so, um, for me, I find that environment to be, yeah, it's easier. There is a particular kind of openness actually that is present in that kind of environment. And I think part of it is also just being with a teacher. And usually you're sitting next to someone who's very vibrant and expressing content, and then being able to put that kind of out, following their tone, which is in the case of my teachers, very inspiring to me, very inspiring, kind of engaging tone. And so the whole environment is kind of an inspiring and engaging environment. It's when you're trying to put words onto a page that are going, you're imagining a reader alone with the page and the words that you put there. It's I feel it's actually more difficult context because, for example, in an oral interpreting context, you don't just have the words. You have the presence of a teacher, you have the tone, you have so many things that are part of that process of communication. And then putting text on the page, you have to pick one word that's going to represent something that, you might have in an oral interpreting context a little bit more freedom to express something in a way that might connect with more people. So I think that the textual translator's job is really, it's a harder one, I actually feel, to be able to convey things in a way that are inspiring to people who are reading the translations. It's a different process. It's a really different process. I do also enjoy it. I think I guess part of that is actually really connected with being a writer, working on writing, reading poetry, if you're going to be translating verse, reading inspiring texts as a way of getting this ability to express oneself in a particular way. So for me, I guess mm, it really is a different process. It really is a different process, actually. And a lot of the students that I work with, I teach translation in a MA program in translation at Rangjung Yeshe. I'm teaching this semester. And many of my students are studying translation, not to translate into English, but to translate into Chinese, into Spanish, into German, lots of different languages. And so I encourage them always to read Dharma texts in their native language as a way of connecting with expression there, because you really do have to familiarize yourself with a way of expressing the teachings in a written style. There's so many styles that you could use, right, to translate. So I get a lot of benefit from reading translations by translators whose work I like as a way of helping me hone my own skills. But that is actually the case for me with oral interpreting too. Whenever I hear a translator interpret, I am always sitting there with a notebook writing down words like, oh, wow, they said that way better than I normally do. That's a great idea. So yeah, it's they're different worlds, but and I think we have to prepare for them in different ways. Yeah, I'm not sure if that really answers your question.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you so much. We have a lot of wonderful questions rolling in, so I might jump to some of those if that's okay. So, one audience member has written in saying, Dr. Dalton mentioned that having a practice connection to a text can make it easier to translate. But sometimes I feel the opposite, because having practice with it, I love the way that the text is expressed so much in the original that I can't figure out how to render it in my native language without losing its quality. I personally find this difficult because I love to chant Buddhist devotional songs. How can translator practitioners develop the ability to capture what they learn and value from practicing in Dharma languages and distill it into their native language?
Yes, that's actually, that really is, that's a very good question. It is true, actually. I also sometimes try and avoid working on translations that are too close with personal practice for a variety of reasons. But it is true, right? That when you are working with a text that you read and that you love in whatever language you're working from, and that it resonates and that you chant it, and it sounds so beautifully, and it sounds so wonderful, so beautiful. And then when you try and say it in another language, it just kind of falls flat. This is a challenge that we face. Trent, you, I know, work with that a lot because you work with songs and chanting. So you actually maybe have even more to say about that than I would. But I think for me, part of the process of translating textually into in a way that will work well for a reader involves reading it out loud and going through the process actually of, I have not translated into from chantable text into chantable text, but I do have translator friends who do that. And so you're going to, if you're doing that kind of thing, you're going to, I think, always sacrifice some degree of closeness to the original. But if part of what's so amazing about the text is the inspiring quality of the language, then I think that's part of what we are meant to try and translate too. So in the same way that when a teacher is speaking, you want to translate his or her tone, because that's part of what the teaching is. When a text has a quality, an inspiring quality or tone, particularly with song, with verse, with these kind of with these kind of texts, I think that is part of our responsibility to try and preserve that as much as possible. And sometimes it really does mean translating in ways that you might not do if you were doing an academic translation of trying to really produce exactly the words of this and that and put in brackets what you're, so your advisor knows that word wasn't exactly in the text and the advisor knows that that it wasn't there and so on. It's a different context, actually. So producing practice text for people's personal practice is a different process. And than producing texts in a translation context that are not intended specifically for that. Liturgical texts in particular are hard because you want it to be inspiring to the reader so that they get some feeling. Yeah, so I think maybe reading out loud is one helpful technique, and also reading to a Dharma friend who maybe also does the practice, and how does it land to you? How do you feel? Can be a really helpful way as well.
Thank you. We have a couple of questions taking a slightly different angle, thinking back to the process of your training as becoming an oral interpreter and a translator of written texts. One audience member writes in particular that they've benefited so much from your translations and have deep gratitude for that. And they ask, what advice would you give a practitioner who may only know the Tibetan alphabet in a few words at this point? Is there a way we can use what might be our very small store of knowledge in the context of translation as practice? Should we listen to our teacher and try to recognize a few words as they fly by? Should we look at our sadhanas and puzzle out the words as we practice once in a while? What would be
Yeah,
your...
that's a great question. Well, I think like I said, I don't think it's necessary to know the language of the tradition that you are practicing in order to be able to practice well, right? But I know plenty of really good practitioners in the Tibetan tradition that don't know Tibetan. It's not a requirement. But if it's something, it is real enhancement. For me, it has been a real enhancement. My process of training was not very standard and just kind of, I spent some time hanging out with the Tibetans and, talking to them and not understanding, and then slowly just picking it up through an immersive kind of environment, and listening to teachers with translators, listening to the teacher, then listening to the translator, and kind of going through that process of trying to fill in the blanks, so a lot of not a very traditional classroom environment for me in the very beginning of my studies. I think there's a lot that one can do if one really wants actually to improve knowledge, let's say, of Tibetan in this context. One way is actually sitting down with your practice text and the translation of that text. That's a really good place to start, especially because it's something, for me, I don't know, a lot of people say, like, to me, I just want to be able to read my own personal practice text and actually make sense of it as I'm reading it in Tibetan, because I like to chant it in Tibetan, and I would like to be able to know what it says in Tibetan. And that, I think, if you have some background, a little bit of background, if you studied, I don't know, a year or even a semester or something of Tibetan class, or just picked things up in a particular way, you can actually work through that. Another thing that I encourage people who are trying to learn Tibetan oral, to be able to listen to teachings, is what I just said that I did for many years, just listening to the teacher, then listening to the translator, writing down a word, the teacher said this, and then paying attention, like, what would that be? Like, what did the translator say? And for years I did this, and I would just go up to the translator after the teaching, like, Rinpoche said this, and then I think you said this. Is that, I'm not sure, is that the word? What is that word? And try and give a little bit of context. And I do encourage, actually, translation students who are wanting to study oral interpreting to do that. Just active listening, and active reading through your own practice text is a really good place to start, I feel.
We have another stream of questions coming in that relates to your experience as a scholar practitioner and reflecting on that dimension. Let me just add one sort of personal reflection. I was really struck by the way you centered altruistic intention in translation, and I was trying to think about that in the context of many academic contexts for which centering altruistic intention may seem challenging for various reasons in terms of the structure and culture of those spaces. But let me read what one audience member has brought forth here. Thank you, Catherine, for your transparent and open reflections on being a scholar practitioner. I'm wondering if you're willing to say a few things about how you navigated/currently navigate being transparent as a scholar practitioner, particularly in spaces where that combined identity might be less accepted. So thinking perhaps of your time as a graduate student at UC Berkeley and other places that you've been in environments that center a particular kind of academic learning.
Yeah, I've been very fortunate in that I haven't really found that particularly difficult, honestly. I think it's, as I mentioned, I think that kind of culture is changing a little bit, in the sense that there is an acknowledgement that it's fine to work in an academic environment if one is a personal, is a Buddhist practitioner. And my advisors, well, I mean, I came from 10 years in Nepal, studying in a monastery. So they knew where I was coming from. It wasn't like a guess. And they knew that I was planning to come back and continue teaching at Rangjung Yeshe. And so there was, I was pretty transparent about my intentions for doing doctoral work. And honestly, the reason I even did a PhD, Chökyi Rinpoche told me to. So that's very interesting. I've had encouragement from my teachers in the, traditional Tibetan teachers, to engage in academic study. And it's been really beneficial for me personally as a translator, as a scholar, as a practitioner. I've learned a lot. And I am really grateful for those kind of opportunities. I think I'm quite, because I serve as an oral interpreter for Chökyi Rinpoche, then I'm really in that kind of world. It's not like I had the choice to kind of not disclose that aspect of my life. I don't think what the degree to which one discloses or doesn't disclose one's personal practice in those kind of spaces, academic spaces, I think honestly there's no need to, I would say. And except that it is nice to see people doing that, just in the sense that it gives other people permission to feel comfortable being open about that if they want to, right? And so I have, in my academic work, one of my teachers, I asked for some advice on working on my dissertation, um, because I was working on some tantric topics, and I felt a little bit of discomfort and not sure what to do about how to engage with that in an academic environment. And I asked three different teachers, and they all said, first of all, you're translating this text, whatever it says in the text, you translate that. The focus of your study, you can choose to focus a particular way or not, but you're working in an academic tradition, you do it academically, fully, correctly, the way that it's done in that kind of tradition. But that doesn't mean that you can't bring your own inspiration with the text and your own connection, the connection you feel with the text and what you're learning, that is going to come out in your work anyway. That studying things historically, for me, is not I don't find that antithetical to a traditional approach, actually, towards the Buddhist teachings. I don't feel like those two things have to be in opposition. And I find, for me, that it's more of an enhancement, actually, to study Buddhist history and to work with these kind of historical texts and to work with the, philological minutiae and so on. Traditional Tibetan and Indian scholars also worked with philological minutiae, like they did. That's what you have to do when you work with text. So I think that kind of, like, bringing modern academic engagement with Buddhist materials and bringing a personal engagement can happen in the same space. And as I said, I don't feel like there's I feel, rather than being detrimental, actually bringing those two things together can be enhancing and enriching. And I haven't felt yeah, I've been very fortunate, actually, in the professors that I worked with, in the environment that I've been in, that I felt quite comfortable just doing. I also like academic work. I'm like a nerdy scholar. It's fun for me. So it's yeah. So I've had a lot of it's been pretty comfortable and enjoyable for me in both of those kind of spaces. Yeah.
Thank you. A few audience members were asking about kind of just that, like what are the benefits in particular of academic work within the larger spectrum of the things you do? And I think your answer there spoke to that, as well as how you framed that in the talk. I wanted
I
to
could
ask,
actually add just
if you want to,
briefly that
please.
some of the methodology that I learned in graduate school, working with textual methodology, philological methodology, working. I mean, it's what I'm teaching actually now in Rangjung Yeshe, in our MA program, working on multiple witnesses of text and trying to make sense of different readings and making a good choice about which reading. Like when we translate, and again, we shouldn't think that that's just a modern academic approach. Traditional scholars did that. They just didn't write footnotes telling us that they were choosing between those two. They were like, this one's better, and then they just made a version of the text that had that reading, right? They didn't leave traces in the sense of footnotes in the way that we do. But working with text in that way is really helpful. And if our aim as a translator is to produce the most authentic translation that we can, and the translation of the best, closest, most correct version of the text that we can get, then we actually have, I think, a responsibility to try and do that kind of work. And I learned a lot about how to do that kind of work in graduate school. And so it was, yeah, really helpful for my work as a Dharma translator. Not oral interpreting. I didn't learn anything that really helped my oral interpreting in graduate school, but for textual translation, absolutely. Absolutely.
That's fantastic. I'd like to ask you a bit more along these lines. And I was thinking back in your talk when you spoke about the specific benefits of studying Buddhist history to being a practitioner in the present. I think, sort of as you said, normally we might think about the benefits of studying Buddhist doctrine or Buddhist ritual or, meditation practice, etc., for being a practitioner in the present. But you sort of advocated also for the importance of studying Buddhist history. So it got me thinking that sort of Buddhist history, including the history of Buddhist institutions and polities, at times can and has encompassed tremendous violence. How does sort of historical examples of violence, um, both sort of direct and structural, affect or shape how you relate to practice, to peace, to violence in the present?
Yeah. Well, the thing about institutions is that they're human, and humans live in, the Buddha Dharma is taught because we live in the world that's samsara. And so the Buddhist teachings themselves are meant to guide us out of that kind of environment. But because we as people, right, just check my own personal experience right now, like I'm a Buddhist practitioner, but I'm far from perfect. I think that we all have, can see the difference between, the teachings and then the people, right? Who are working on maybe embodying those teachings, and we don't always succeed, right? And so I think when I look at examples of that historically, of violence and this kind of conflict and so on, both historically and in the present, then I see it a little bit in that context, that there are ways in which there are things that we're trying to cultivate and trying to be and trying to become. And if we were already done with that, we'd be out of here anyway, right? Like it wouldn't be, this wouldn't be an issue. And so, yeah, that's a little bit how I tend to relate to that, both in the present context as well as in the past context. But just in general, studying the history of studying Buddhist history in general, I find it helpful and inspiring because, again, the teachings are one thing, but the teachings, however you relate to Buddhist texts, right? The words of the Buddha, let's say the Kangyur, like in Tibetan, these translated words of the Buddha, the teachings were received by people and passed on by people, and the teachings were transmitted by people, by humans in the world. And so seeing the way, and so their fingerprints, right? All of these historical Buddhist fingerprints are all over those things that we receive. And that's can be super inspiring and can be really interesting and can be really helpful for us in terms of reflecting on the process of working with those kind of teachings ourselves. So for me, that's partially why I find approaching Buddhist history, the study of Buddhist history, so engaging and helpful.
Thank you. We have time, I think, for one more question, and I'm going to bring in another question from the audience. This will be sort of continuing this reflection on history, but taking a little bit in the realm of doctrinal or intellectual history, which was certainly one major contribution of your scholarly work in your dissertation and other contexts. But thinking about the way Indian Buddhist terms and concepts changed over the years, and how that showed up sort of concomitantly in Tibetan Buddhist translations, and then how those how those Tibetan language texts are understood by living lineages in the present. In essence, this listener is asking, how do you sit with those differences across time? So they were mentioning it particularly in this pre and post Tantra context, but whoever you might like to take this question, I think it would be valuable.
Yeah, that is a fantastic question. And it's a topic that I really like because sometimes people learn a Buddhist word, and then they think like, okay, that's what that word means, full stop, end of story. No way. It means a different thing in a text in the 8th century than it means in a text in the 12th century. Mahamudra, right? This word. In later tantric texts has this sense of a particular type of meditation practice, right? The sense that we have in modern Tibetan context, Mahamudra practice, right? In the 8th century, Mahamudra refers to the visualizing yourself as a deity. And so if you're reading a later meaning into the 8th century text, you're like, what? Mahamudras, the hands and a face? Like, what kind of hands and face can Mahamudra, right? You can't make sense of it. And so we absolutely have to understand these terms in their context. And so for me as a translator, I feel when I am translating a text that circulated, right, let's say in the 8th century, then I have to understand it within what was going on in the 8th century in India, right? And maybe that text is understood differently in modern Tibetan tradition. And so one might even, depending on, I mean, I don't know. When I translate, I like to try and translate the text in the context. Like I work for 84,000, right? So we're translating the Kangyur. And for me, translating those texts in the context in which they circulated in India is really important. It is a different thing to understand that text through a 14th century Tibetan commentary. And you might end up with a different translation if you were following that. And those are both absolutely perfectly valid projects, both academically as well as from a Buddhist perspective. Totally, actually, both, right? They're not necessarily the same thing. And so I feel because I like to engage, I don't know, as a historian, I guess, I feel it's important when we're working on a translation to engage a text in its specific historical world and context. But any given text might have like centuries of those, multiple ones. And so it's a totally valid project to engage with any of them. You just have to be really clear about what you're doing. You just to introduce, like, hey, I'm reading this text in the 17th Taranatha's interpretation, whatever. It's fine, absolutely fine. But you just tell your reader, and then someone who's working on a translation of that text within the context of like a 9th century commentary is going to have a different way of reading it and translating and interpreting it, and that's okay, actually. Yeah, yeah. It's great, even, not even just okay. I think it's great. That's also part of what I find so inspiring about the Buddhist tradition. It's so diverse and so, it's unfolding, right? It's unfolding. And there's such an amazing continuity too. Both the kind of development and continuity aspects are, to me, really inspiring. Again, like when I was working on my dissertation, reading something that was written down in the 9th century, early 9th century, and then just feeling like, oh, that verse, I just could have heard Chukuni Rinpoche saying exactly those words yesterday. It's like not like the feeling actually of the content of what was being communicated so incredibly you could just feel actually the continuity of lineage when reading old text and being also in the presence of the modern tradition. And so that continuity is super inspiring to me, and also just the differences, ritual development, really inspiring. It happened to me just yesterday. I was working on a text that I'm translating for 84,000 and was just feeling like, Rinpoche just could have said this. It's a 7th century text, that's when it was first circulating. So yeah.
Thank you, Catherine. This has been really extraordinary, both, of course, your exquisite talk and then your generosity in engaging with these questions. We had a real abundance of questions from the audience today. Again, my apologies that we didn't get a chance for all of them, but again, our thanks from those of us here at Khyentse Foundation and from everybody here to you, Dr. Catherine Dalton, for sharing your time, insight, and expertise with us today. Thank you.
Thanks, Trent, and lovely to see you. As I feel like we're back at Berkeley for a moment.
Indeed, indeed. It's been wonderful. Thank you. So I just wanted to announce that the next lecture of this series will be in December. It will be in Chinese and will be hosted by my fantastic colleague, Dr. Mingyuan Gao. So please stay tuned for further information about this talk, which will be the final talk for 2024. As always, to stay in touch about upcoming events, visit www.khyentsefoundation.org/events and www.khyentsefoundation.org/story/series/Goodman Lecture Series to learn more. Thank you again to all of you for joining us. We hope to see you again soon. May you all be safe and well.